This has got to be the noisiest I think I've ever heard this library. Well, it's a delight to be here, and it's quite an opportunity that you've all had to sit for 3 months, and it's a really precious opportunity. And some of you have participated in the research that we've done this year, and some of you, I guess, research that we've done in previous years. And I thought what I'd try and do tonight is say something about what we've done for the last 5 or 6 years now with research here at Barry, with Vipassana, and also research that we've done in South Asia with the same Vipassana practice. Before I begin, if there are people in the room who are involved in the current T-scope study and who haven't yet been run as subjects, it wouldn't be useful to be here because it would contaminate. We couldn't use you. So if there's anybody who are you participating in the study?
Well, last year I didn't participate, but I was here while you were talking about what it was.
There's a different thing that we're doing at the moment.
Oh, it's like
if you are before you leave, before no, before you leave, it's being taped so that you can get it. I'm sorry that we didn't get you earlier today. Okay. If you are participating in the current study and we haven't got to the final testing of you, if you're here now, I'm going to talk about some of the results of tonight's thing, and it would affect the. I suppose I should say something about motivation for doing this research to begin with. As I see it, if you do the practice, the effects that you get are quite self-evident from doing the practice. But I'm involved in a community of people, most of who are either researchers or clinicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, internists, and they are involved in the Western tradition very much in helping people and healing. And they're probably the people that would be the most likely to benefit from the practice immediately and apply it to people, and they're least likely to come in contact with it. So part of the motivation is to try and do, in Western standards, hardcore scientific research on meditation, and the results will stand for themselves. And that, you write it up in professional journals, and for some people, that's a language that's comprehensible, and who may be initially doubtful and skeptical. It can be for a particular audience, I think, a useful way of introducing the practice. And 4 or 5 years ago, when we were starting this, maybe that time wasn't so useful, but we've done a lot of research here, and the results have been overwhelmingly fruitful. And we've been able to bring this now into very traditional audiences. For example, I was this last week at the National Institute of Mental Health in Washington, and talking with a lot of brain scientists and other people who would never look at this stuff. They were quite interested in the findings, because the findings are very clear cut. And we've talked a lot at traditional hospitals in the Boston area. At Cambridge Hospital and Harvard Medical School, where I work, we've just set up a behavioral medicine department, which we will be using meditation and imagery and hypnosis and other things in the treatment of illness and in the psychophysiological disorders. And since all of the Harvard medical students rotate through this, they will now get this as part of their traditional training, and it will be part of their worldview. So that the pendulum is starting to swing in that other direction, and there is a sort of limited usefulness for certain kinds of people. to do this kind of thing. All of the people who do this research are yogis, and they've all sat here as well as other places. When we started doing the research, one of the things that was very dissatisfying to me was, and you read the research coming out of meditation in this country, mostly TM research and some Zen research, you get the impression that meditation has a lot to do with certain kinds of physiological changes, like slowing your heart rate and getting your breathing more regularized, and that it leads to deep relaxation. But for those of you who've had the 3 months, you know that meditation doesn't have a lot to do with relaxation. And it's very hard work. And somehow trying to reduce it to Western concepts of relaxation responses is not very useful, and it doesn't get at the heart of what happens in meditation. Our own approach, and when I first got started in this work 14 years ago, was to really become a traditionalist, which means learning the traditions. I took the time while I was in graduate school to learn the languages, to learn Tibetan and Sanskrit and Pali. I've done a fair amount of translating of meditation texts, and try and let the texts and the people who now teach and practice those speak for themselves about what actually happens as the practice unfolds. And then to take that as a way of saying, okay, if this is what the traditions, authoritative traditions say happens in meditation, can we then say, how would we look at that in Western terms? And what came out of that was two things. One is that it was very clear that meditation seems to unfold in stages, that there are certain very clear-cut transformations that happen along the way. And the second thing is that meditation is probably not best understood physiologically, as it's done in the West, but it's probably better to be understood in terms of changes in perception and attention and awareness, as you all well know. So that we began to look at meditation perceptually. A lot of my own thinking and writing about this has been in terms of translating and comparing different traditions in terms of the stages of the practice. And then after looking at how the stages unfold conceptualized in the traditions themselves, the next phase was to go back and look at, okay, what would a Western psychologist say about these stages, and can we get any validation of the traditional model of the stages of progress along the path? And some of the research that we've done has really panned out, others has not panned out, so I'm going to focus tonight on what seemed to really pan out. In terms of the stages of the practice, there are three main stages. There's the preliminary practice, there's the deep concentrative practice, or the levels of samadhi, and then there's the stages of insight. And those are the three main chunks of the practice. You can divide it more finely, but those are the three main areas. And then after going through the stages of insight and achieving some deep level of equanimity, for some people they're able to penetrate and then reach the first enlightenment. Now in the tradition there are 4 levels of enlightenment. And in the first 2 levels of enlightenment, there are certain kinds of changes that take place, and in the last 2 levels of enlightenment, there are much more profound changes that take place. So what we did was we, one study, we selected subjects and meditators in 5 groups. The first group were people who were doing the preliminary practices. Second group were people who had attained a good samadhi state, beginner samadhi, access samadhi, or one of the more refined levels of samadhi. Third group were people who were doing one of the many traditional stages of insight, according to the practice, as laid out in the Prasiddhamagga and Mahasi Sayadaw's Progress of Insight, or whatever else. The fourth group were people who had attained one of the first 2 levels of enlightenment, and the fifth group were people who had attained one of the last 2 levels of enlightenment, the real masters of the tradition. And having those 5 groups now, we began to try and see if what made them either similar or different. Now, the way we arrived at those groups was twofold. We had teachers rate where they thought people were in the practice, nominate people for the different groups. And we found that the teacher ratings in the various times over the years that we've done those were strikingly consistent. The inter-rater reliability, for those of you who know statistics, with Pearson R was somewhere between 0.8 and 0.94, which in terms of social science research is very impressive. It means that teachers do seem to have a good idea of where students are along the practice, and they tend to agree with that even when they rate students independently. So there's something about the descriptions that people give that's pretty consistent, and teachers seem to know where people are. Second thing that we did is from these questionnaires that some of you have taken, there are certain questions on that that are not very understandable unless you're in the state, and people answer them in certain ways. So if, on the one hand, the teachers rate you as being at a certain level of practice, and you also answer the questions for that level of practice, then we're pretty reliable, we know pretty reliably that a person is likely to be in that particular level of practice. If you only get one of those two things, then we didn't include the people in the group. So the people that we have in those 5 groups are pretty likely to be in the stages that we're talking about. Now, one of the studies that we've done, it was really 4 or 5 years ago now, was a Rorschach study. In the Rorschach, you know, are the ink blots, and you look at the ink blots and you see things, and you see bats and butterflies and people and whatever else. Now, we originally gave the Rorschach as a personality test along with some other things that we were doing, because what we wanted to know was whether or not people using the same instructions, and everyone gets exactly the same instructions, over time are different. They have different experiences because they have different personality. And that we had not intended to give the Rorschachs at the end of the 3-month course, only at the beginning. And we sort of discovered this by accident. We gave 1 or 2 Rorschachs at the end, and they were so profoundly different from anything we'd ever seen before that we decided to give the Rorschachs to everybody. And that initiated a whole project on using the Rorschach is to say something about the stages along the way. So let me review the Rorschach study first, and then I'll talk about some of the perceptual things we're doing now. When people sit for 3 months, and they're at the relatively early stage of practice, and by the preliminary practice, it really means like mostly everybody here. It takes a long time. There's a sort of inertia effect. It takes a long time to really get a deep samadhi state. And there are very few people in the course of the 3 months who really stabilize a samadhi for any long period of time. But it's possible to do. And, you know, you usually have somewhere between, out of 100 people, maybe 2 to 10 people a year doing that. But not a lot. It's quite difficult. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But the people who take the Rorschach before and after the meditation, the Rorschachs after 3 months of 16 hours a day meditation, whatever you do, they look pretty much the same. There are not a lot of striking differences. There are several things that are One of the differences is that there are ways of scoring the Rorschach for conflictual material, emotional material, and that there's a lot more emotional material after 3 months of meditation than before 3 months. Outside of that, the Rorschachs look pretty much the same. Okay? So, I mean, that's consistent with what we know about people who start to do intensive practice. When you really turn your awareness inside, all sorts of stuff comes up. Thoughts, memories, intense feelings. And you spend a lot of time becoming aware of the content of your experience, mostly emotional content. And it can be quite stormy going. Now, that turns out to be an interference to the practice, although it's very difficult to get through. And the reason why more people don't achieve samadhi is because that content is very fascinating. And we tend to explore it rather than to just letting it be there and let it run through. So the key to the practice is to learn to pay attention and to train awareness very carefully, regardless of the content. But when we first turn inside for a long period of time, the content is so rich and so fascinating that we tend to do that at the expense of paying careful attention. And it slows you up. And that's why the beginning stage really takes a long time, so far as the research seems to say. If you can just let the content be there and you get less interested in it, and you train awareness in a very refined way, then you get to the samadhi levels pretty quickly. However, you know, not to kind of convey a kind of achievement orientation here, there's a great deal of usefulness about learning about the content of ordinary experience, particularly in painful emotional experience. And there's a whole level of insight that you can get from just spending days and days and months doing that kind of thing. It teaches you a lot about how the ordinary mind works, and particularly how it doesn't work. Now, with those people who got a good samadhi, either access samadhi or something beyond, the Rorschachs were quite strikingly different. And for someone who's given thousands of Rorschachs before, they look like nothing I've ever seen, either with normal college subjects or clinical Rorschachs of a lot. They looked at the ink blots, and they basically saw ink blots. And they didn't have the inclination to make it into bats or butterflies or people. They didn't come up with images. Right? They left it, and they described the edges of the card, the shape of the card, the color, the shading of the card, and they found the shading to be moving and swirling in various patterns. And they spent just as much time describing the pure perceptual features as they did in before meditating, and coming up with images like bats and butterflies and other kinds of patterns. It's rather exciting because this is totally anomalous finding. And no one ever produces this kind of stuff on the Rorschach. And that was a rather tightly designed project where we used the staff as the controls. And we also did a year follow-up. And what we had found was that, when you get 30 people in the study doing this kind of thing and none of the controls do it, it's pretty clear-cut findings. You see the result of the intensity of the samadhi practice. And then we found that a year later, for those subjects who we were able to do follow-up with, some people kept it and some people didn't, and that was pretty much a function of how much people continued to practice and how much they didn't. The people who didn't continue to practice, the effects wore off, and the Rorschach looked like normal Rorschachs again, and the people who continued to practice Dan? Several hours a day was enough. 2 or 3 hours is enough. Now, the Rorschachs for the people who had refined their samadhi and now were beginning to train their awareness to look at how the mind unfolds into samadhi and to gain insight into some of the classic positions of Buddhism, like the three characteristics: suffering, impermanence, and selflessness. The people who were really focusing on insight in very refined levels of samadhi, their Rorschachs looked strikingly different from the samadhi Rorschachs, and almost the opposite. Now, these people gave now the ordinary person who takes the Rorschach gives roughly around 1 or 10 cards in the deck, and people give roughly around 2 responses per card. And that's on the average. Sometimes you get 3, sometimes you get 1. But these people gave us 10 responses per card only because we stopped them at 10. We were getting like 7 to 8 hour Rorschachs, and we figured that was enough. And then several days later, we would test them again, and they would come up with mostly new content. Now, if you give a Rorschach to a normal person, and then you give it to them again some months or years later, they produce roughly 2/3 of the same responses. Right. But these people were doing something very different, you see. They were constantly turning over the mind, and the content would just be there, and they just let it run through. And a huge amount of content would come up. And it was very richly elaborated. It wasn't just, they just wouldn't see like an animal. They would see an animal and they would tell you this whole story about it. Very rich. And it seems to correspond to what we know about a certain level of samadhi, where you can let the content come back up and just let it run through your mind very quickly. And the Rorschach seems to illustrate that that's exactly what was happening for these people. So those are the 3 main stages of the practice. Yeah. Okay. When you get a good access samadhi, there are 2 perspectives. From the perspective of the point of observation, the awareness, it's steady and uninterrupted. There's no gaps. From the perspective of the content, what you're observing, you don't see patterns, perceptual patterns, and you don't think. There's no gross content of the mind. Everything is reduced to little vibrations of bits of light. And that's a good access. And like in Burma, when I was there, they had very specific criteria for what they meant. It means that you ought to be able to sit for an hour and not have more than 5 thoughts come up. And you should be able to catch those thoughts very quickly. And then dissipate them. So there's no content like thinking. Or even if you were to hear a sound like a bell, you wouldn't get the concept bell. It would just be the vibration. Right? And everything's very light at that point and moves very quickly. Right? So that's the people who could hold their mind on that level. They produce these kind of Rorschachs with no content, which is exactly what the tradition says, and exactly what the Rorschachs seem to validate. Now, there's different refinements of them. not to go into all the details of it, just to stay with the main chunks. This stage where there's uninterrupted awareness and there's no content, and then there's a stage where even more refined, you can let everything come back up. You run it through very quickly. And then, yeah. I think you'll find that although the practice is difficult, and you hear this material and say, well, how can I didn't do any of that. I was here for 3 months and none of that happened. You'll find that there's a kind of an inspiration that comes out of this, though, in the sense that it really is very clear cut how this unfolds. And if you keep working at it, it does work. Well, that's an interesting point, in how much our expectations and our beliefs affect how much we gain in the practice. You know, one of the factors of enlightenment is confidence, the belief that you can actually do it yourself, and that if we have doubt, it interferes with being able to do it.
On the content of the ordinary mind, you change the content, you say, and the highly refined.
The inside Rorschach?
Right.
Well, first of all, they're producing much more volume of content than the ordinary mind does. And they're not reacting to it, they're just running it through. There's no self anymore, it just runs through. No reaction. Like the tape loops in mind. Now, those are all, in the tradition, those are state effects, which means that if you stop practicing, the effects tend to wear off. You know, you come down from the samadhi states and so forth. You know, it's the enlightenment that causes a more permanent change. So we began to look at people who may be enlightened. And, you know, it's very difficult to tell. But, you know, we let the teachers in the tradition nominate who they thought were more likely than not to have achieved first path or second path. You can tell from the descriptions that people give you, and you know, there's a certain way it sounds, but you don't know for sure. But anyway, we put people in the group that might have had that kind of experience. And no, we have two groups. We have a group for South Asian people, and then we have a group for Westerners. Now, because there's all sorts of complexities about interpreting Rorschachs from other cultures, I'm only talking about the Westerners now. Because there's all sorts of complicated methodological things about working with Rorschachs from other cultures. So now the Rorschachs from the people who may have achieved the first 1 or 2 levels of enlightenment were quite surprising to us, because on a superficial analysis, they look like ordinary Rorschachs. There are only 2 differences from the ordinary Rorschach off the street. One of those differences was that about 20% of the content on the Rorschachs had to do with different forms of energy, or energy in interaction with form. And the other difference was that people would see 2 levels of perception simultaneously. That they would see the form. They would come up with images in their mind like bats and butterflies and people, the same way that most people do in the Rorschach. And yet, in addition to that, they would say that the bat or the butterfly or the person was simply an emanation of energy. And they could see it simultaneously, either as the image, or as just a manifestation of dancing energy. And it's that dual level of perception that was totally unique about this group of people. Now, the other thing that was quite striking is that if you score these Rorschachs for conflictual material, these people still illustrated a normal array of ordinary human conflict. Now, that says something very important. And it means that if you get enlightened, at least at the first levels of enlightenment, it does not take away human conflict and suffering. Right? You continue to suffer. Right? But something does happen, and this is important. Something does happen. When we scored the Rorschachs for defensiveness, these people were used minimal defenses in the psychological sense against the conflict. Now, according to the tradition, when you achieve the first level of enlightenment, then what happens, you see, is in ordinary experience, the content of your mind and the awareness of that content are bound up with each other. Right? And so that we're always reacting to the content in some ways. During the moment of enlightenment, the cessation experience, the content drops away, and awareness is just there. So that there's a shift that occurs, and you can say that the awareness goes to the other shore. Right? And when that happens, you see, it breaks the connection, the ordinary connection between the content of experience and the awareness. And because of that now, after enlightenment, all the content comes back. But the awareness is no longer inextricably bound up with it. Right? So what that means is that you would expect the Rorschachs to look like ordinary Rorschachs again. But there's some subtle but profound differences taking place. Because now the content, even the conflicts, you still play them out. But they're just there in your experience. And you experience them with some more intensity even, more full awareness, more sensitivity. And yet, you're not reacting to them in this very subtle way that the mind is ordinarily built to react to them. They're just there. So there's no reactivity, there's no defense against it. And in that sense, there's less suffering. But you still play out the conflicts. Right? But you don't experience suffering the same way. You may still make other people suffer from your conflicts, but you don't experience it yourself at that stage. And, you think of the Zen saying, when before practicing mountains and mountains and rivers, and then after practicing mountains become mountains and rivers become rivers, and it seems like Rorschachs become Rorschachs again. And these Rorschachs are very unlike the Samadhi Rorschachs, which have all these unusual things on them. So what's exciting, you see, is the Rorschachs, what people are doing on the Rorschachs really do reflect the stage of the practice that people were at. Now, the last was the Masters group, and those were the people who were again believed to have achieved the penultimate or the ultimate enlightenment. And we didn't have, of course, many subjects in this group. But it was most interesting because the subjects that we did had all did something, again, we'd never seen on the Rorschach before. Each one of them, I can't say. I can't say. Particularly for this group, I have to. You have to preserve the confidentiality of the people. But the Rorschach stuff has already been published. But no, who it is, it won't come out. But what was interesting is that these people, most people, they give you 2 responses per card, they said. And, and the cards, they're not related together. These people all gave roughly 2 or 3 responses per card, as one would expect. But they related all the responses together across the cards. And they did it in such a way that it became a systematic unfolding of a body of teaching. Now, each one of them taught something very different. But they related all, one of them it started with the negative states of mind, and then by the end of the cards was talking about how the path of meditation has led to the freedom from all of the states. And one of the others went into the different levels of perception, from ordinary perception right up to extraordinary levels of perception in the universe. And each one of them did this kind of thing. Now, you hardly ever see a person who will relate responses from one card to the next. The only time you ever see that kind of thing is with some paranoid schizophrenics. But how do we know that these masters were not paranoid or were not religious fanatics? What's the difference? Well, one of the things is that when paranoids relate cards together, they only can do it haphazardly. And we've never seen anyone who has what we call this integrative style of being able to relate all 10 cards together and still have the form be good. It's quite an extraordinary human feat to be able to do this on the Rorschach. The second thing is that when paranoids relate cards together, and they do it in not only a haphazard way, but an idiosyncratic way. They present content from their own mind. All of these people didn't present idiosyncratic content. They presented a consensual body of teachings. No, it's left ambiguous. Now, what's interesting is that there is some data from other cultures, not with yogis, in which people have seen this kind of integrative style of Rorschach before. There was a study of Apache shamans done by Bryce Boyer some years ago. And what they did is they had the Indians themselves rate which shamans seemed to be legit and which ones were questionable. And they had this one shaman that that all of the Indians were in conflict about. They either thought this the greatest shaman of all time or totally a fake, and they couldn't decide which. But this shaman was totally another class. And that shaman produced a Rorschach in which they integrated all 10 cards, just like what we found. And there, of course, the teaching was different. It was the different levels of the universe that the shaman goes in the fight of the soul. And then there was someone else who studied with shamans in the Fiji Islands and also produced a Rorschach like this with one of the shamans there, who again was very controversial. So I mean, this unusual style may be indicative of a real transcendent state. And maybe not just tied to meditation, but however you get there, through shamanism or through meditation or whatever else, there are extraordinary human beings, and they tend to do the same thing on Rorschachs. Now, the other thing about these Rorschachs was very exciting was that in the Master's Rorschachs, unlike the people who were at the earlier stages of enlightenment, there was absolutely no evidence for human suffering, human conflict. And it's just like the traditions say, that there is a point in which there's a total reorganization, and there is no longer any experience of human suffering. It is gone. At least, we don't have a large enough sample, but from the people that we have, it's quite suggestive. Have three. Three. From that group. What was the question? Yeah. Now, the Rorschach stuff was very suggestive and I think helpful in some ways. But some people won't be convinced by it because the Rorschach is sort of soft science. So that one of the things that we've tried to do is go back and use more traditional perceptual paradigms. And for those of you who've seen us working with the funny machinery, that's what we've been trying to do now. We've been using an instrument called a T-scope, or T-scope for short. And a T-scope is a machine that you look in the screen, and it has an electronic board that can flash things on the screen. And essentially what it can do is it can flash events on the screen very quickly, in terms of, let's say, 1,000th of a second. And it's a way of actually studying what people do with very quick perception. And some of the initial thought that we had is that, when people train their awareness, their own stream of consciousness, more and more quickly, then we get a real refinement of being able to pick up more and more quick events in the mind. And that the T-scope would be the best way of studying that, because it actually can flash events very quickly. And it would give us some real solid data as to whether or not the meditation really does change perception in some fundamental way. Now, last year, we did a project involving flashes of light. And in the first study, the yogi looks into the screen, and there's a kind of a light, white field. And then on top of the white field, there'll be a flash of light, looks like a flash of lightning. And you can vary the duration of that flash. And this is a threshold study, which means if you flash it too quickly, the person won't see it. You'll just see the white screen. If you flash it very slowly, the person will see it as a flash of light. And you can randomly flash bits of light and change the duration, and you can find exactly what the threshold is for the person. And we did that before and then after the meditation course. And we also used the staff as control group, based on the assumption that the staff is all involved in the same practice, but they're just not doing it intensively. If you find change in one group and not in the other, it tends to suggest that it's due to the practice. Well, that was quite fruitful, that the yogis experienced quite a significant drop in their threshold for the single light flashes after the 3 months, and as compared to the staff controls that didn't change. It means that your perception is becoming much more sensitized, and again, it's obvious in the practice. We didn't do it over time. When people, it's hard to do this kind of thing because people come for the 3 months and then they come back some other time and we don't know, we never get a chance to get them again. Well, because that's true, but that's exactly true. But you see, it's a conservative position, which means that if you still show a profound change, and the staff And then you say it's the intensity of the practice that does it. We also did normal people off the street as another control. I'll say something about that in a minute.
What was the lowest threshold?
Well, I can't say off the top of my head, but there seems to be a lower limit. You can drop it so much, and then it doesn't change very much. There are biological limits to how much you can drop it, and that seems to vary according to individuals. Well, ideally, that's what we'd like to do. We're somewhat limited, and this is not funded research. At least so far, it has not been funded, and it's a little bit far out still. And so that, the T-scope is expensive machinery, and we basically are borrowing it from another laboratory. And because of that, we don't, if we had our own machinery, we just leave it on site here, and then, of course, we'd be able to get people. But until we get our own machinery, we can't do that kind of thing. So we're somewhat limited. The other part of that study was to put 2 flashes in light over time. And you can see what the mind does with successive events over time. You can flash one light and then another light. And you can vary the interval. You can leave a long time between them or a short time between them. Now, the mind has a limited resolving power, which means that if you put them too close together, the mind will summate them, integrate them. So they're seen as one flash rather than 2. So the task is very simple. They look in the screen and you say, do you see 1 or 2 flashes? And they have to say either 1 or 2. And then you randomize the interval between it. And then you can find out, again, the amount of space between 2 events in time, and that people can actually discriminate. And the findings were, again, quite good in the sense that the yogis were able to see the 2 flashes of light closer together in time. And the staff control didn't do that as well. And they were physically significant results. You want to say something, Michael, about this year? We've done most of that today. This is Michael Fort, who's doing the research business.
We did a study last year looking at yogis and staff. We started 2 months or 2 at the end of the 2 months. We found that for both the 2 flashes and detected 1 flash, that almost every single yogi got much shorter. They could see flashes that were much shorter duration, and they could distinguish 2 flashes that were much closer together. Whereas the staff didn't change much at all. Some went up, some went down, but it was always just a very little bit. So essentially the staff didn't change, but the yogis did change. We also compared teachers, yogis, staff, and normal people to each other. And we found that the quickest minds were with the teachers, as you would expect. Next were the yogis, then were the staff, and then the normal people.
All 2 groups of people who are practicing were quite profoundly different from people off the street who didn't meditate. So it seems the implication is the more you practice, the quicker your perception gets.
I find the gap in your study is like, the staff may have had other periods in their life practice something like a year. Of course, I'm wondering, like, how much this diminishes.
That's fine. But if you can still show, it's a conservative control, which means that the staff will wash out some of the effects because they practice.
This year,
Yeah.
between my years with next year's staff, how would I compare? You know,
Yeah.
As a staff member,
Still works. Sure. I mean, that's a concern, but it still works.
Well, we really didn't find that you diminish if you don't practice. You pretty much stay the same, but you don't get quicker as you do if you practice intensely.
It drops down to a certain point, and it's like a lower limit kind of thing. If you practice intensely, it drops you down to a certain point, and then you don't change very much beyond that.
Are there any changes from year to year?
Again, we don't have the equipment to be able to do follow-up studies yet, year to year. There is another thing that we did, which was sort of interesting, that we used the teachers last year, and as Michael said, they were quicker in their perception. But they did some other things that were most interesting. That we used the two flashes of light, and we held the two flashes of light at threshold, that means that some of the time they can get it right, and some of the time they don't get it right. And we asked them to describe their experience each time they saw the two flashes, and we did it a number of times, so that for maybe an hour they got two flashes of light, and each time they had to describe what it was they actually were aware of. Now, what every one of them did was that they didn't see the two flashes of light. They actually saw 8 events. And the 8 events were the moment of arising of the flash, the brief duration of the first flash, the going out of existence of the first flash, the gap between the two flashes, the moment of arising of the second flash, the brief duration, the going out, and then the gap, and then repeating the cycle again. Now, they didn't always do that, and it was somewhat a function of moment-by-moment concentration. But that was quite striking. Yeah.